There is a particular kind of silence that descends on a mountain town in the hours before a hard winter storm, a silence so complete and so heavy that it feels less like the absence of sound and more like the presence of something watchful, something that has drawn a slow breath and is holding it, waiting for you to exhale first. Marin Callaway had lived inside that kind of silence for 3 years, and she had mistaken it, as broken people sometimes do, for peace. She was 41 years old, 5 years out of the United States Coast Guard's Maritime Law Enforcement Division, and she had brought exactly 2 things with her to the Colorado high country when she'd finally stopped driving: a black and tan German shepherd named Kodiak, who had served 2 deployments as a Navy SEAL working dog before a shrapnel injury retired him to her custody, and a length of braided paracord she wore knotted around her left wrist, the same paracord that had once cinched a life vest closed on a man named Petty Officer 3rd Class Daniel Reyes, who had not survived the night she'd done it. The cord was frayed at one edge. She never repaired it. She told herself this was oversight. It was not oversight. She was driving the mountain road above Hatcher County on a November evening when Kodiak rose from the rear seat and pressed his nose against the passenger window with the specific, low-frequency alertness he reserved not for deer or elk but for something wrong, something human-shaped and suffering, and Marin pulled over into the gravel without a conscious decision, the way you reach for a wall in the dark. What she found in that frozen roadside ditch would tear open a corruption buried beneath 3 decades of donated library wings and campaign handshakes and Sunday pew sitting, and it would tear open, with far less mercy and far more precision, the sealed room inside Marin Callaway that she had been calling her heart. She had been driving back from Ridgecrest, the nearest town with a hardware store that stocked the specific grade of pipe insulation she needed, before the temperature dropped below 0 and the water lines at her property froze again. 41 miles of mountain highway in November was not an errand. It was a commitment, a small, private war waged against altitude and isolation, and the kind of cold that gets inside your reasoning and tells you nothing is worth driving this far for. She had accepted the war as she accepted most things now, with her jaw set and her eyes tracking only as far as the next curve, her attention a useful, narrow instrument she had whittled down to function and pointed at the immediate. The truck was a 12-year-old Ford with a cracked dashboard and a heater that worked on its own terms, which is to say it worked reliably for the first 15 minutes of any drive, and then subsided into an ironic suggestion of warmth, as if the system had fulfilled its moral obligation and was leaving the rest to your imagination. The forecast had promised flurries. The sky was now delivering something the Weather Service would later describe as a significant weather event, which Marin interpreted as a significant failure on the Weather Service's part, to be honest, with anyone who had to drive through it. The road had turned white-edged, and the pines were bending in hard, rhythmic gusts, each gust moving through the tree line like a shudder through something living, like a body trying to shake something loose. The headlights pressed against the dark and found only more of it, an endless production of more dark, more snow, more road unspooling ahead, as if the mountain were generating it fresh just to stay ahead of the truck. Kodiak had been asleep on the back seat, or performing the version of sleep that retired military working dogs perform, which is more accurately described as a state of armed rest, his ears neither flat nor fully raised, but in the intermediate position Marin privately thought of as standby. He had maintained this posture for 38 miles without deviation. Then the ears came up. Both of them simultaneously, with the kind of clean, mechanical precision that made Marin's own nervous system respond before her mind had processed the signal. His nose moved to the glass. His breath fogged a slow oval on the window. He held perfectly still in the stillness that was not uncertainty. She knew the difference. She had known the difference for 3 years. She pulled over and stopped the engine. The storm sound was enormous without the truck to dampen it, a great lateral rushing that stripped the warmth from her face in 4 seconds, and then kept taking. She zipped the heavy vest and said, without inflection, the single word she used when she needed Kodiak to lock onto whatever he had found, and lead rather than heal. The word was seek. He was over the guardrail at the top of the embankment before the syllable had finished leaving her mouth, moving with the controlled economy of a dog who had done harder things in darker places and had never once confused speed with urgency. Marin followed him down into the ditch, sliding the last 4 feet on frozen mud and dead grass, catching herself on her palms, the cold of the ground slamming through her gloves like a reprimand, like being told something she hadn't asked to hear. The bottom of the ditch was choked with dead grass stiffened by ice, the stems rigid as wire, and beneath them a thin skim of frozen water over black mud that gave slightly under her boots before deciding against it. The wind at the bottom was different from the wind on the road, deflected by the embankment into something circular and disorienting, a sound like a large room with a problem. Kodiak was standing at the far end of the culvert opening, and he was doing the thing he did when he had found what he was looking for and needed her to come witness it for herself. He was perfectly still. His tail was level, not raised, not tucked, level. That posture Marin had learned over 4 years of working beside this dog meant, I have found a living thing, and it is suffering, and what happens next belongs to you. She crouched beside him and looked into the culvert, and for a moment the headlights from the road above provided just enough angled illumination to show her what was there. A red fox. A vixen, lying on her side at the far curve of the corrugated pipe, with 4 kits pressed in a tight, shivering cluster at her belly, their small bodies tucked so close together they appeared to breathe as one. The vixen's left foreleg was wrong in a way that took Marin's eyes a moment to decode, because the wrongness was so complete it resisted quick categorization. It was bent at a place where no joint existed. Broken. The fur around it was dark and stiff with dried blood that had cooled and congealed in the night air to a color that was almost black. She had been here for some time. She was breathing in the shallow, rapid way of an animal that has moved out of pain and into the quieter territory just past it, the territory where the body stops protesting and begins simply accounting for what is. Her eyes, when they found Marin's, were amber and steady and exhausted beyond anything Marin had a word for, not afraid, past fear, present in the way of something that has given up on the outcome and is simply enduring the moment as it arrives. The kits were alive. One of them nosed at the mother's belly with a blind, determined faith, rooting with its entire body toward warmth and milk and the continuation of being, with no awareness whatsoever of the cost that faith was requiring from the animal who sustained it. Something shifted in Marin's sternum at the sight of that small, insistent motion. A tectonic rearrangement. A thing moving that had not moved in 3 years. A thing she had told herself was not there. She counted. 4 kits. She looked at the vixen. She looked back at the kits. She studied the angle of the broken leg and the specific quality of the dark stiffness in the fur. She had been a search and rescue officer for 11 years before she transferred to maritime law enforcement. And she had spent those 11 years learning to read evidence with the part of her brain that did not need to be asked twice. She read it now. The brake angle was not consistent with a vehicle strike. It was not consistent with a fall. What it was consistent with, precisely and only, was a jaw-type trap, the specific mechanical closure of 2 toothed plates on a limb too small for the trap's intended target, which would explain both the transverse nature of the break and the way the fur was disturbed in a pattern radiating outward from the injury site rather than compressed beneath it. The trap had been set, and the trap had released, and whoever had set it had either not checked it in the hours since, or had checked it and made a decision about what they found that was not the decision a person makes when they have a conscience. There was a word for that. The word was not hunting. She did not permit herself to stay in the anger. She noted it, the way you note the position of a doorway. She would return to it. Not now. She looked at Kodiak, and she looked at the vixen, and she said quietly, into the corrugated pipe and the wind, the thing she had been taught to say on the water, when a situation exceeded what she'd planned for, and the only available tool was willingness. She said, "All right," as if the storm had put a question, and she was answering it, as if the question had been waiting 3 years for this particular answer. She shrugged off the heavy vest, unzipped the flannel beneath it, wrapped the flannel around both arms up to the elbows, and reached into the culvert with her bare arms, and her paracord wrist, and her 3-year-old grief, and she brought the vixen out. The cold of the pipe was a different cold, a contained, airless cold that smelled of wet rust and frozen earth and something animal. The fox did not fight her. That was the part she could not let herself think about for a very long time afterward, because an animal that does not fight, when a human reaches for it in the dark, is an animal that is past fighting, an animal that has made a choice available only to the exhausted, which is to be simply present for whatever comes next, to stop spending the last of itself on resistance, and to extend, in its place, the exhausted trust of an animal that cannot afford not to. The patience of that trust pressed against the sealed room in Marin's chest with a specific, steady, insistent pressure, the same pressure she had been using to keep the door closed, but aimed from the other side. She got the vixen into the front of the truck, wrapped in the flannel and the emergency thermal blanket from the kit behind the seat, and she got the 4 kits scooped into her hat, which was a wool knit hat from the hardware store's clearance bin, pumpkin orange and shaped, in a structural sense, like a sleeping bag designed for a person who measured 7 inches. She set the hat on the passenger floor with the heater vent aimed at it, and was briefly grateful that the heater had chosen tonight to be fully operational. Kodiak rode in the back with the composure of a dog who has been asked to accept stranger logistics, and has agreed, on principle, not to make it a whole thing. She made a U-turn on the mountain road in the storm, which took 3 attempts, and a quantity of faith she was not sure she still possessed, and she drove back down the mountain toward the property, both hands on the wheel, the truck sliding once near the lower switchback, and then catching, the tires finding purchase on the frozen gravel with the tentative commitment of something that has decided to try. The vixen's breathing changed in the warmth of the cab. It slowed and deepened, which was either improvement or the other thing, and Marin did not look over because she could not drive the mountain road and also look over. She kept her eyes on the road and counted the yellow lines as they came up through the snow and disappeared. Counting was the first anchor. She had not known that 3 years ago. She knew it now. When the counting stopped working, she said aloud into the cab, "Forest Service Road 7. The name of the road she was on. Then she said, "Kodiak," naming the dog in the back seat, who acknowledged this by breathing audibly once in the way he did when he was monitoring her monitoring situation. Then she named the feeling she was currently suppressing, which was hope, a poor tool for precision work, imprecise and subject to error, the kind of tool you use when it is the only one left in the case. Those were her 3 anchors. Road, dog, feeling I am not ready for. She used them now. The property was 14 acres on the eastern shoulder of a ridge above the Hatcher County line, accessible by a dirt road that in November became a provisional road, a road that existed by mutual agreement between the truck and the frozen ground and the goodwill of the elevation, subject to renegotiation at any moment by any of the 3 parties. The cabin had been a hunting camp before she'd bought it, for a price that told you a great deal about the roof's current views on its own obligations. She'd spent the first 2 years of her tenure there, correcting those views, 1 sheet of plywood and 1 tube of sealant at a time, arguing the matter of the roof's integrity with the focused, patient obstinacy of a woman who did not have anything else she was trying to accomplish. The outbuilding, a timber-frame structure she'd rebuilt from the foundation up in the second summer, insulated and wired against her better judgment about how long she intended to stay, was warm and dry and equipped with a heat lamp system she'd installed, for reasons she had not at the time been willing to name. She understood those reasons now. She understood them in the way you understand a decision you made before you knew you were making it. A decision the body made while the mind was occupied elsewhere. She put the vixen on the central work table on the bed of clean straw she'd laid, without knowing she was laying it, and she examined the leg, with the headlamp clamped to a support beam, and the focused, technical calm of a woman who has learned that feeling and function must take turns, or they will simply cancel each other out. The leg was broken at the radius, clean transverse fracture, consistent with a jaw trap, catching the limb at velocity and releasing. The break was at least 18 hours old, possibly closer to 24, based on the swelling pattern and the temperature of the adjacent tissue, which was cool but not cold, which meant circulation was compromised but not absent. There was no tissue death yet. That was the thing that mattered most, and she held it like a number, a precise and countable fact. The 4 kits were small, eyes still sealed, probably 14 to 16 days old, still entirely milk-dependent, not yet capable of thermoregulation on their own. She settled them against the vixen's flank beneath the heat lamp, and watched their breathing for 60 seconds and counted it. All 4. All breathing, she said out loud and with no particular audience in mind other than Kodiak, who had taken his position in the doorway with his working posture fully restored, ears in the intermediate position, spine level. All right. 4. That is 4. She sat down on the floor of the outbuilding, with her back against the workbench leg, and her knees up, and her bare arms cold from the wind, and the pipe, and the 3 in the morning air, and she pulled out her phone. Reception up here was a negotiation, conducted through a single bar of signal that appeared and vanished, according to principles she had never been able to fully identify, possibly atmospheric, possibly philosophical. She moved to the southeast corner of the outbuilding, where the bar sometimes resolved into something actionable, and she got enough to make a call. And she called the only person in Hatcher County she knew had both the knowledge and the disposition to help with what she was looking at, which was a broken fox and 4 kits and the specific quality of evidence that the break represented. She called Dr. Nadia Osi, wildlife veterinarian, who ran a mobile practice out of a custom-built truck she had named, without apparent irony, the Situation Vehicle. Nadia had been in Hatcher County for 4 years, long enough to have formed opinions about most of it, and to have shared those opinions only with people she had already decided deserved them, which was a list constructed with the same careful attention she gave to dosages. Marin had made the list 6 months ago when she'd helped Nadia extract a mule deer from a collapsed fence line without being asked, without complaint, and without needing to be told what to do. She had just seen what needed doing and done it. And Nadia had watched her do it, and had made a calculation. Nadia had not said thank you in words. She'd said, same time next Tuesday, as if they'd been doing this for years. Marin had understood that was the thank you. She'd accepted it the same way Nadia had offered it, without ceremony, which was the only way either of them knew to accept things. Nadia arrived 40 minutes later, in the Situation Vehicle, a silver 4-wheel drive truck that had been rebuilt inside to carry a refrigerated medicine cabinet, a portable surgical setup, a portable radiograph unit the size of a large briefcase, and, in the passenger seat, a tabby cat named Procedural Objection, who Nadia described as the practice's quality control consultant, and who Marin had privately concluded was the practice's emotional center of gravity, the warm and opinionated fact of the operation around which everything else organized itself. Nadia got out into the storm with the radiograph case in one hand and a duffel in the other, and walked to the outbuilding with the brisk, economical movement of a person who does not waste energy performing urgency when actual urgency is already available and does not require performance. She was 46 years old, compact and precise in everything she did, with the kind of stillness in her hands that Marin associated with people who had been required to be very careful for a very long time, and who had made a peace with that requirement. She stood at the work table and looked at the vixen for 35 seconds without speaking. The only sound was the wind at the outbuilding wall, and the small, insistent sounds of 4 kits maintaining their existence under the heat lamp. Then Nadia said, "Radius. Clean brake. Traction trap. Someone didn't want to pay for the kill." Marin said, "That's what I read." Nadia said, "You read it right." She set down the duffel and began extracting the radiograph setup without any further discussion of what they both already knew, because what they both already knew was the beginning of something, not the end, and the beginning required first that the animal in front of them be helped. Everything else could wait for what came after. They worked until the first gray suggestion of morning appeared in the outbuilding's single east-facing window. The kits made it through the night. All 4 of them, which Marin told herself she had not expected, and which Kodiak's complete absence of surprise suggested she had fully expected, and was simply managing her investment in the outcome with the caution of someone who has learned that hope is a poor tool for precision work, but had deployed it anyway. The vixen's leg was splinted and immobilized, a process that Nadia performed with the kind of focused, unhurried precision that Marin recognized from her own best professional hours, the hours when the training took over completely and your hands knew what to do even when your mind was still arriving at the location. The splint was lightweight and correctly placed, and the vixen's body temperature had stabilized, and her breathing had eased from the shallow, rapid accounting of an animal past pain into something slower and more deliberate, something closer to sleep. When her eyes finally closed, they closed with a quality Marin chose to call relief rather than examine too closely, because examining it would have required Marin to look at what was in her own face at the same moment. She was not prepared to look at that yet. Nadia drank 2 cups of the coffee Marin had made at 4 in the morning, coffee that Nadia characterized with the dry precision of someone choosing words with care as a bold choice in the direction of fluid. She made no further comment. The coffee remained in her cup, and then, subsequently, not in her cup, which was the only review that mattered. Kodiak approved of Nadia. This was not a small thing. Kodiak had been selective about his approvals since retirement, in the way of someone who no longer has a professional obligation to tolerate, and has chosen to exercise discernment with the full authority of his remaining years. He sat near Nadia throughout the night's work, and once, when her hands went briefly still over the splint materials in the way of someone who has encountered a difficulty that is not the animal's but her own, Kodiak leaned his shoulder against her knee in the specific way he used to ground a person who needed grounding without being told they needed it. Nadia looked down at him. She said, "How did you know?" Kodiak did not answer. He never answered. He simply stayed. That was his answer, and it was always enough. It was in the flat, pewter light of that November morning, with the storm quieted to a gray muttering, and the outbuildings smelling of antiseptic and warm straw, and the dark coffee that had committed to existing, regardless of quality, that Nadia found the thing. She was examining the vixen's right ear for signs of ear mite secondary infection, which was standard protocol in an animal that had been under extended environmental stress, running her fingers along the cartilage fold with the methodical attention of someone who knows that what is missed at this stage will cost more at the next one. Marin was at the far end of the work table, preparing the first supplemental feeding for the kits, a process that required a specialized syringe, a specifically formulated replacement formula she'd kept in the outbuilding, with the same unexamined foresight as the heat lamps and the straw, and a quantity of patience that she was assembling from somewhere she hadn't known. She still kept stores of it. Nadia said, "Marin, come look at this." The tone was not alarmed. It was the tone of someone who has found a thing that confirms a thing, a different register entirely. Marin came. She looked where Nadia was pointing with the fine-tipped penlight, in the fold of the vixen's right ear, threaded through the cartilage in a way that would not be visible except under close examination by someone looking for it, or someone too thorough to stop short of it. A small loop of thin wire, rust-colored, deliberate in its placement. From the wire hung a tag, a stamped aluminum disc no larger than a shirt button, and on the disc, in characters too small to read, without the penlight's concentrated beam, was a number, a 12-digit alphanumeric sequence, and below it, a seal, a stylized bird, embossed so lightly it was nearly a suggestion, rather than a mark, above the words, Territorial Wildlife Reserve, Hatcher County, Est, 1997. Marin held the penlight steady and looked at the tag and felt the ground shift, the way it had shifted in the culvert. That same tectonic rearrangement. But this time, colder and more directional, less like grief and more like recognition. She had spent 11 years in maritime law enforcement, processing the specific grammar of official identification systems, the difference between a tracking code and a ledger entry, the difference between a number that tells you where an animal is and a number that tells you what an animal is worth. A number that long was not a tracking code for a managed population. A number that long was a transaction reference, she said quietly. That is a sale tag. Nadia said, "Yes. That is exactly what that is." Neither of them said anything further for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the tree line in a single, long gust, and then fell still. She had heard the name Carson Pruitt exactly twice before this morning. The first time had been in the hardware store in Ridgecrest, in the context of a donated wing on the county public library, mentioned by the man behind the counter in the offhand, admiring way that people mention the names of donors in small towns, as if being in proximity to the name conferred some reflected legitimacy, the way people mention universities they did not attend. The second time had been on a campaign sign at the county road junction, a yard-wide placard in the blue and gold of the county commissioner's race, showing a man in his late 50s with the groomed, confident presentation of someone who had been photographed performing decency for so long that the performance had fused with the face and become indistinguishable from it. Carson Pruitt, County Commissioner, Hatcher County, endorsed by the Stockmen's Association, the Ridgecrest Chamber of Commerce, the County School Board, and, in smaller text at the bottom of the sign, as if the endorsement was simply one among equals, and not a description of who owned what, the Board of Trustees of the Territorial Wildlife Reserve. Nadia knew the name with a different weight. When Marin said it aloud in the outbuilding, holding the tag under the penlight and turning it slowly in her fingers, Nadia's hands went still in the way they had gone still over the splint materials in the night. But this time, there was nothing medical about it. This time it was the stillness of recognition. Of a thing long suspected arriving in the body as confirmed fact, the specific interior jolt of a suspicion that has been living as question and has just become answer. Nadia said, "He chairs the reserves board. He controls the stocking permit system." She said it in the tone of someone completing a sentence they had started silently 3 years ago, in the small hours of some earlier morning, when the evidence had not yet been sufficient, and the cost of being wrong had seemed too high. She said, "My predecessor here, the veterinarian I replaced, she filed a formal complaint with the county about irregular permit activity at the reserve, anomalies in the intake and release documentation, discrepancies in the head count reporting. 3 months after she filed that complaint, she was in a single-car accident on the forest road above the reserve's western gate. They classified it as weather-related." She paused. Her hands were flat on the work table. They were very still, Marin said. How long ago? Nadia said, 4 years. 4 years ago February. Right before I was hired, by an outgoing board member who submitted his resignation the month after I started. Marin set the penlight down carefully on the work table. She picked it up again. It was something to do with her hands that was not closing them into fists. And she needed that, she said. Did you know when you took the position? Nadia said, I suspected there was something. I thought it might be simpler than this. I thought it might be mismanagement or negligence rather than deliberate. I thought for a while I was being paranoid. Marin said, you weren't being paranoid. Nadia said, I know that now. I've known it for some time, but suspicion and proof are different countries, and I couldn't get from one to the other. The reserve comprised 912 acres on the western slope of the ridge, adjacent to the national forest boundary, licensed by the state for the managed propagation and release of several game species. This was a legitimate structure on its public-facing surface, the kind of arrangement that existed in multiple western counties and that, conducted honestly, served both conservation and landowner interests simultaneously. The corruption was not in the structure. The corruption was in the arithmetic of what entered the reserve and what was permitted to leave it, and in who was permitted to perform the leaving. Animals were tagged and documented in the entry ledger as resident population members, protected under the reserve's management designation, which meant they could not be legally taken on or adjacent to reserve grounds during restricted seasons. Animals were then, according to what the tag in the vixen's ear had begun to suggest, and what the hidden record would later confirm with the unambiguous specificity of column headings and fee amounts and initials, made quietly available to a paying clientele that accessed reserve grounds during closed season under the protection of the management designation itself, a designation that Pruitt, in his 17-year tenure as board chair, had spent considerable legal and political effort constructing to be as definitionally opaque and as procedurally difficult to audit from the outside as possible. The fox was not a game species. The fox was, Marin believed, an indicator animal, tagged and catalogued as a reserve resident to inflate the documented head count of managed species and thereby obscure the actual rate at which animals were cycling through the reserve under illegal take. It was, as accounting frauds go, both elegant and brutal, using the machinery of conservation law to launder the revenue of its precise opposite. She did not go to the county sheriff directly. The county sheriff was Roy McCready, 17-year incumbent, uncontested in his last 3 election cycles, whose name appeared on the Pruitt campaign signage in the same blue and gold as the stockman's endorsement, placed in the middle register of the sign, where endorsements with genuine political weight were traditionally positioned. She had noted this some weeks ago without placing it anywhere in particular, the way you note the position of a door in an unfamiliar room, not because you have any immediate use for it, but because noting exits is a reflex that does not retire when the job does. Now she placed it. The door between McCready and Pruitt was open, and open doors were not what she needed. She called the Colorado Parks and Wildlife District office when the morning was bright enough to justify it, and she asked for the district wildlife manager, and the district wildlife manager turned out to be a man named Grant Faber, who had the phone manner of someone who had spent 30 years being asked the wrong question by people who were very confident it was the right one, and who had developed a constitutional wariness of calls that began with a property owner's name and the words evidence question. He said, "Who are you, and why are you calling about the territorial reserve?" She said, "I'm a property owner in Hatcher County, and I have a wildlife evidence question that requires in-person documentation." He was quiet for 4 seconds. Then he said, "I can be at your location in 2 hours." Marin said, "Bring your own coffee." He said, "Already planning to." She was unsurprised by this. Grant Faber arrived in a Colorado Parks and Wildlife green and gold truck with a dent in the front quarter panel and a travel thermos he carried with the proprietary vigilance of someone who has extensive field experience with the coffee of people who have never been asked their opinion on the matter. He was 61 years old, a large, slope-shouldered man with a gray mustache and the weathered, unhurried patience of someone who has spent 3 decades looking at what gets done to wild places by people who believe wild places exist primarily for the doing. He looked at the tag under the penlight for a long time. He looked at it the way he looked at most things, with the specific, unhasty attention of someone taking a measurement rather than forming an impression. Then he withdrew a state-issued camera from a vest pocket and photographed the tag in situ, the wire loop, the cartilage fold, the aluminum disc, all of it, from 3 angles. He said, "This animal was taken from reserve grounds." Marin said, "I found her in a roadside culvert above Forest Service Road 7, injured by what Dr. Nadia Osi, the county's attending wildlife veterinarian, has confirmed is consistent with a jaw-type traction trap. The reserve's western boundary sits 2 miles from that location," Faber wrote in a notebook. He wrote for some time, with the focused, economical hand of someone who has been writing field notes for so long that the notation requires no deliberation. Marin appreciated the writing in the way she appreciated tools that did exactly what they were designed to do without announcing themselves. When he finished, he said, "I need to be clear about what I can and what I cannot do here. And I need you to hear both halves of that in the order I'm giving them. What I can do is open a welfare and wildlife management audit under my authority as district manager. That audit will be methodical, it will be documented, and it will be irrefutable when complete. And those 3 properties together are what make it useful. What I cannot do is move against a sitting county commissioner or a reserve board on the basis of one animal's tag without a complete and unimpeachable chain of documentation." Marin said, "I understand that," Faber said. "Understanding it and accepting it are different things, and I've worked with people who understood it clearly and accepted it very poorly, and that gap cost the case." Marin said, "I spent 11 years in maritime law enforcement. I know what a clean case requires, and I know what impatience costs. I've paid that cost. I'm not interested in paying it again." Faber looked at her over the thermos. He looked at the vixen and the kits under the heat lamp. He looked at Kodiak in the doorway. He said, "All right then." He said it in the same register she'd used in the culvert, the register of a question finding its answer. The first overt act of intimidation arrived 48 hours after her call to Faber, which told her 2 things with reasonable precision. That Faber's inquiry had already reached someone inside the reserve's administrative structure who had a reason to monitor the district office's activity, and that whoever had chosen to respond had not yet developed the discipline to wait and see how serious the inquiry was before committing to a reaction. The message was physical, a 9x12 craft envelope left in her rural mailbox at the end of the dirt road, containing a single photograph printed on office paper and folded once. The photograph showed her truck parked at the Ridgecrest hardware store, taken from across the street at an angle that included the license plate clearly in frame. No note, no text, no explanation beyond the image itself, because the image was the explanation. The implication was the message, and the message was, "We know you, we know your vehicle, we know where you go, and we are watching you go there." She examined the envelope without touching the photograph, photographed both with her phone, and drove to Faber's district office and handed them over in a zip closure freezer bag, which she acknowledged to Faber was not ideal evidence packaging, and which Faber agreed was the correct principle executed with the available materials. He filed both items as supplemental evidence to the audit and told her to document any further contact methodically. Any vehicle she saw more than twice on the forest road, near her property, any interference with her structures or her access road. She drove home in the failing afternoon light and sat with the paracord between her fingers and named the road she was on, and the dog in the back seat, and the feeling that was neither fear nor its absence, but something more useful than either, which was readiness. The feeling of being pointed at something that mattered. She had missed that feeling. She had not known she missed it until it came back. She did not tell Faber about the kits in that first meeting. Not because the kits were unrelated, but because the kits were the most related thing of all, and she had not yet found the words for what the kits represented in the architecture of this situation. They were evidence of the same cruelty that the tag represented. They were also 4 small animals, eyes still sealed, entirely milk-dependent, running on the blind determined faith of creatures too young to have learned what faith costs. They were alive because she had stopped on a mountain road, in a storm, and gone down into a ditch. Nadia came every other day to assess the vixen's healing and to supervise the feeding protocol she'd established for the kits, a process requiring a specially formulated canine milk replacement, kept at a precise temperature and administered through a syringe that the kits had collective opinions about, opinions they expressed through the medium of their entire small bodies. The kits had made it through the decisive first 72 hours. They had made it through the first week. By day 8, they were all 4 of them consuming adequately, maintaining temperature, and exhibiting the specific, furious, disorganized vitality of creatures who have decided to exist despite the available evidence to the contrary and who are not interested in discussing it. Nadia watched Marin manage the feeding syringe for the 3rd kit of a morning session. On day 9, the kit in question making its positions on the matter known through its entire body, from its sealed eyes to its thrashing hindquarters, and said, "You have done this before." Marin said, "Not with foxes." Nadia said, "With what then?" Marin said, "People, mostly, small ones." Nadia was quiet for a moment with the weight of someone allowing a thing to land, rather than deflecting it. She said, "Was that the work you left?" Marin said, "That was the work that left me." She said it without inflection, the way you say a thing you've rehearsed saying, casually, until the inflection no longer comes. The kid stopped thrashing and accepted the syringe with the sudden resignation of an animal that has run out of argument. Nadia watched it eat. She said, "I lost a colleague. To work." She did not elaborate, and Marin did not ask her to, because some losses carry their own explanation in their shape, and the shape of this one was already familiar. The second act of intimidation arrived on the 8th day after the storm, and was more direct and more expensive in its message. Marin came out of the outbuilding after the morning feeding to find the fence posts along the eastern perimeter of her dirt road, access broken, not by weather, not by vehicle contact, which would have produced a different pattern of damage, a compression and a fall rather than a shear. These had been snapped at the base, 6 of them in a line spaced with a deliberateness that was its own kind of signature, and snapped with sufficient force to suggest a tool and a purpose, not an accident passing through. Kodiak had not alerted during the night, which meant whoever had done it in the window between 2 and 4 in the morning, and had done it with sufficient care and quiet to stay below the threshold of even Kodiak's operational rest, which required a specific kind of professional knowledge about how working dogs sleep. That knowledge told her something about who Pruitt was willing to employ for this work. She photographed the fence line systematically, each post from 2 angles, the breaks and the surrounding ground, annotated the photographs with time stamps and compass bearings, and called Faber before she called anyone else. Faber walked the line that afternoon with his own camera and his notebook and said, "This is escalation," she said. "I know." He said, "I want eyes on your access road tonight." She said, "I already have eyes on my access road tonight." He looked at Kodiak. He said, "Good enough." The paracord was cold against her wrist in the afternoon wind. She pressed it there with 2 fingers and felt the braiding, the familiar, imperfect texture of it. And she named the road she was standing on and the dog beside her and the feeling that had settled into her chest over the past 8 days, like a piece of furniture that has always been in the room and that she is only now noticing has been there, which was the feeling of a purpose that was hers and not simply assigned to her, a distinction she had not understood before losing the first kind. Nadia found the hidden record, and she found it because she was thorough in the way grief makes a person thorough, directing the attention into the specific corners and gaps and overlooked surfaces of the world where the thing you are looking for might have been pushed by someone who needed it out of sight. 3 weeks after the Vixen's rescue, with Faber's audit accumulating its slow, irrefutable weight of documentation, and with Pruitt's apparent confidence beginning to develop the first visible hairline cracks of anxiety, Nadia drove to the reserve on a Tuesday morning under the cover of a routine, large animal welfare check, which she was fully licensed and authorized to conduct, and which required access to the reserve's on-site management structures as a matter of state veterinary licensing compliance. She had confirmed, using the public meeting calendar posted on the county commissioner's website, that the reserve's operations manager would be in Ridgecrest that morning for a commission subcommittee meeting. She went alone. This was not what Marin had asked her to do, and Nadia was aware of this, and she went anyway, because some things are done alone, or they are not done at all, and she had been waiting 4 years for a morning like this one. In the reserve's management office, behind a locked cabinet that her master key, issued 4 years ago by an outgoing board member who had since resigned, still opened, she found a secondary ledger. Not the digital record system that anyone with administrative access could review. A physical notebook, marbled cover, elastic closure band, the kind of notebook that exists because whoever keeps it does not fully trust the security of systems accessible to others. 83 pages of columns, written in a careful, economical hand. Dates, animal identification codes, fee amounts, initials. The initials recurred. CP appeared most frequently, sometimes twice on a single page. The initials EA appeared as co-signer on the fee collection columns with a regularity that constituted its own category of evidence. Nadia read through the first 40 pages standing at the cabinet. Then she turned to the back section and found the entries that stopped her. 3 pages, near the end of the primary entries, where the column format shifted and the margins contained additional notations in a different hand, a smaller and more careful hand, the hand of someone who was documenting something in the only professional language available to them, and who understood that what they were documenting was dangerous. The hand was not Nadia's. The entries in this secondary hand were dated 4 years ago. The last of them was dated 10 days before February's Forest Road accident. Nadia stood in the management office of the Territorial Wildlife Reserve in Hatcher County and looked at the handwriting of a woman named Dr. Sylvie Marchant, her predecessor, who had held this attending veterinarian position before her, who had seen what was in this ledger and had documented it in the margins in the language of her professional obligations, and who had then filed a complaint, and who had then died on a forest road in February, whether that had been assessed as the cause and had not been the cause. Nadia put the notebook in a plastic specimen bag. She locked the cabinet. She walked out of the management office and across the reserve's gravel parking lot to the situation vehicle, and she got in, and procedural objection expressed his categorical objection to the duration of the absence from the driver's seat. She called Marin from the parking lot. She said, "I have it. I have a physical ledger documenting 4 years of organized illegal, taken fee collection on the reserve grounds. I have welfare notations in the margins that I believe are in Sylvie's hand. I have initials that correspond to Pruitt, and to at least one operational co-signatory." Marin said, "Are you safe right now?" Nadia said, "I'm in the parking lot. I am leaving the parking lot now." Marin said, "Come directly here. Do not stop anywhere between the reserve and this property." Nadia said, "I was not planning to stop." Faber received the ledger that evening. He examined it for 40 minutes at the work table, while Nadia annotated the pages with the careful cross-referencing precision of someone who has been holding this thread for 4 years and is not going to release it imprecisely now. Kodiak kept his position in the outbuilding doorway. Procedural objection positioned himself on the corner of the work table with the proprietary authority of a consultant who has arrived late and is noting this discrepancy professionally. Faber said, "This is the core of a wildlife trafficking prosecution under the Colorado Wildlife Act." He said, "This ledger, combined with the audit documentation and the tag evidence, gives the state wildlife prosecutor a substantive, documented case that a county prosecutor cannot dismiss on procedural grounds." He said, "I need both of you to write out your chains of custody in full tonight, and I need to move this to the state office in Denver by tomorrow afternoon." He set down his pen and said, "I also want to be honest with you about the window we are operating in. Once the audit's progress becomes visible enough that McCready's office receives word of it, and that will happen within 48 hours of my filing in Denver, the interval between that moment and the moment when Pruitt understands the ledger is in state custody is the interval that concerns me." Marin said, "How long do you need to get to Denver?" Faber said, "I can be there by 2 in the afternoon tomorrow if I leave at first light." Marin said, "Then we have until 2 tomorrow afternoon." Faber looked at her, and then at the notebook in its specimen bag, and then at Kodiak, with the expression of a man performing a calculation that involves variables he cannot fully quantify. He said, "Try to get some sleep." Kodiak regarded him with the expression of a dog who has heard that recommendation before and has his own considered views on its practical utility. The 24 hours did not hold. At approximately 3 in the morning of the following day, Kodiak came off the floor of the bedroom doorway in a single movement, flat sleep, to full standing operational alert, with no intermediate stages, no stretching, no orienting, just there, and then fully present. Every system engaged, his attention aimed with the specificity of a direction rather than a response. Marin was off the bed and in her boots before the thought had finished forming. She moved through the cabin without lights, using the layout she knew, the way she knew the length of her arms, following Kodiak to the back door, where he stood, with his full attention directed toward the outbuilding where the vixen was, where the 4 kits were. She took the sidearm from the lockbox beside the back door, because she was a woman alone, on a 14-acre mountain property, and keeping it there was not drama but arithmetic. She went out into the cold with Kodiak on her left side, and both of them moved through the dark and the residual snow without sound, in the way that 2 beings move together when they have trusted each other's timing for long enough that the coordination lives in the body and does not require instruction. There were 2 of them. She heard them before she saw them, the specific sound of people who are trying to be quiet and who have some practice at it, but who have not been trained in what silence actually requires, at the level of the breath and the footfall and the weight transfer. They were at the outbuilding side door, the secondary entry, and one of them had a pry bar, and she was close enough to hear the metal contact the door frame, a sound like a complaint. She said, loudly and without any preceding signal, "Stop." The word came out with 11 years of maritime law enforcement behind it, and 3 years of silence behind that, and it had a quality that words acquire from being used in real situations rather than rehearsed ones, a quality of weight and completion, a word that was not inviting a response but issuing a statement. One of them ran immediately, pushing off through the snow toward the east perimeter, fast and committed, gone into the tree shadow before she had turned to track the sound. The second one turned, and she could see him in the ambient light from the snow and the pines, a large man, broad through the shoulders, with a knit cap pulled low and his hand still on the pry bar, and a decision being made visibly in his posture. He took a step toward her. This was a mistake of the specific type made by people who have operated for a long time in environments where there were no consequences, and who have drawn from the consistent absence of consequences the incorrect conclusion that consequences do not exist. Kodiak did not bark. Barking was for alerting. What Kodiak did was take one deliberate step forward from her left side and take the position he had been trained for, weight distributed forward, spine parallel to the ground, head level with his shoulder, and he held this position with a stillness that was nothing like the stillness of an animal at rest, and everything like the stillness of a precise and capable system waiting for a command it was entirely prepared to execute. The man with the pry bar looked at Kodiak. Kodiak looked at the man. The man made the correct assessment. He set the pry bar down carefully, with both hands, and he straightened up, and he put his hands at his sides. Marin said, "On the ground." He went down, knees first into the snow, then forward onto his palms, and she was on the phone with Faber's emergency line before the man's hands were fully planted. And Faber was already awake, which told her that Faber had also found sleep unavailable and had positioned himself accordingly. She named the road, the property, the situation, the count. One in custody, one fled east on foot. Faber said, "I'm calling the state police directly, not the county office." She said, "I know." He said, "I know you know." State police arrived in 38 minutes. Faber arrived 5 minutes after them, with his thermos, and stood at the outbuilding door in the cold, looking at the scene with the contained, weathered assessment of a man who has been doing this work long enough to have stopped being surprised by what people do to wild places and the people who try to protect them, and who has not stopped being angered by it. He said quietly, "To the night in general, good." Then he got out his thermos and drank from it and said nothing further, because the moment did not require ceremony, and he knew it. The man in the snow was named Ellis Autry. He was the reserve's operations manager, the holder of the initials EA that appeared throughout the secondary ledger as co-signer on 81 of the documented fee collection entries across 4 years of operation. He was frightened in the specific way of a man who has done what he was told, under the consistent assurance that what he was told was also what was protected, and who was lying face down in February snow at 3 in the morning, understanding for the first time that the protection was not structural but transactional, purchased by his silence and his compliance, and that the transaction has just ended and the protection went with it. The second individual was located by a state police unit, 2 miles down the mountain road, having managed his departure from the property efficiently enough, but his departure from the county with insufficient preparation. Both men were taken into state custody. State police, not county. Carson Pruitt was not arrested at 3 in the morning in the snow, and Marin had known he would not be, and she held that knowledge with the specific patience of a woman who has learned what happens when you spend that patience before the case is ready for it. What happened instead was documented and sequential and irrefutable. The state wildlife prosecutor in Denver received Faber's complete audit documentation and the physical ledger by secure courier that same morning. An emergency injunction was filed by afternoon, freezing the reserve's operations and enabling seizure of its complete administrative records. The Colorado Department of Revenue opened a concurrent financial inquiry based on the fee columns in the ledger, the amounts in their timing, and the absence of corresponding state reporting. By the following Thursday, Carson Pruitt had been formally interviewed by state law enforcement, in the presence of 2 attorneys, and by the Thursday after that, he had been charged under 7 counts of the Colorado Wildlife Act, 3 counts of criminal conspiracy, and 2 counts of enterprise crime under Colorado revised statutes. He walked out of the Ridgecrest courthouse after arraignment in the same groomed presentation as the campaign photograph. The blue and gold of his tie, the careful hair, the surface maintained, because a man like Pruitt has invested too many years in the surface to let a courthouse morning dissolve it. But the surface is what it always was, and the record beneath it was now a public document. Ellis Autry entered a cooperation agreement 11 days after his arrest. The agreement required his complete testimony and his surrender of a secondary set of electronic records he had maintained independently on a personal device's insurance, which was the action of a man who had understood on some level, perhaps for some years, that transactional protection has an expiration and who had prepared for its arrival. The electronic records extended the documented illegal activity from 4 years to 11. They named additional parties beyond Pruitt. They named additional revenue streams and identified 4 specific instances in which reserve animals had been transported across state lines for illegal take, which introduced federal wildlife statutes to the case, and changed the jurisdictional landscape significantly. And they contained, in a communication thread dated to 3 days before February's Forest Road accident 4 years ago, an exchange between Pruitt and a third party that the third party had been too confident to delete, discussing the complaint filed by the attending veterinarian and the steps that might be taken to address it. Confidence is a vulnerability. She had said that to Faber in her outbuilding 3 weeks ago. She had been right, and the rightness of it was not satisfying. It was simply true, which was the only kind of truth that lasted. Nadia did not speak at the press statement when the charges were announced, and the investigation's broad outlines were made public. She was not asked, and she did not volunteer, because speaking publicly about Sylvie Marchant was not the same thing as knowing Sylvie Marchant had been right. And she had already received the thing she needed most from all of this, which was certainty. The certainty that the accident on the Forest Road had not been weather and had not been accident. The certainty that the complaint, the careful, documented, professional complaint filed by the woman whose handwriting Nadia now knew intimately from 83 pages of a marbled notebook, had been correct and had been suppressed, and had ultimately, through its physical survival in a locked cabinet that someone had neglected to empty, been the evidence that broke the case open. The State Wildlife Agency restored Sylvie Marchant's professional record formally and completely, expunging the notation that her complaint had been reviewed and found to lack substantiation, replacing it with a record of vindication that would stand as the permanent accounting. Her family was notified by the agency's director in person. Nadia was not present for that notification, but the evening it took place, she drove to Marin's property and sat at the work table in the outbuilding, where the vixen was sleeping, in the warmth, and the 4 kits had become a tumbling, furious, entirely individual pile of survival at her flank, and she drank the bad coffee without comment, and they sat in the smell of straw and antiseptic and the particular warm animal smell that Marin had stopped trying to find a word for, and neither of them spoke, because what needed to be said had been said in the record, and the record was clean now, and the silence between them was not the silence of absence, but the silence of 2 people who have done a thing together and know it. Roy McCready did not survive the subsequent months cleanly. The investigation into the documented relationship between his office and Pruitt's Reserve and its operations did not produce criminal charges, but it produced a forensic audit of county administrative funds and a series of documented communications that made his re-election campaign the following May a genuinely contested one for the first time in 17 years. The county clerk, a woman named Cecilia Garner, who had held that position for 12 years and who had a well-documented professional relationship with procedure and an equally well-documented skepticism of any arrangement that could not withstand documentation and daylight, entered the race in February. She won by a margin that said something about 17 years of patience. Marin was still registered in her prior coastal county and did not vote in the Hatcher County election, one of the small administrative oversights of a woman who had not yet formally acknowledged that she had decided somewhere to stay. She noticed, reading the results on her phone in the truck outside the Ridgecrest hardware store, that she had an opinion about them, that she felt on Garner's behalf and on the county's behalf something that was adjacent to satisfaction, but warmer than that and more personal. She filed this observation next to the other recent observations of the same type. The way she had memorized the road to the reserve in both directions without being asked to. The way she had begun keeping the outbuilding heat lamp on a timer rather than cycling it manually. The way the supply orders for the rehabilitation supplies had started to assume a following month as a matter of course, without deliberation, the way a body assumes it will wake in the morning. The vixen's leg healed in 5.5 weeks, slightly ahead of the schedule Nadia had constructed from her most optimistic projections. Nadia attributed this to the animal's general constitution and the quality of the immobilization. Marin said nothing, but she believed the kits had something to do with it, because an animal with something to return to heals differently than one without. She had seen this in people, in the water, in the years before the water, and she saw it now in a red fox on a work table in a Colorado mountain outbuilding. The way the body moves toward the thing it is still needed by. The kits, by the time the splint came off, had opened their eyes and developed individual and fully realized personalities that Marin had begun, despite every intention to the contrary, to distinguish between and to track with a specificity that suggested something she was not yet ready to name. The largest one had a habit of attempting to scale vertical surfaces, failing entirely, and then immediately attempting again with an optimism that was either profound or constitutionally uninformed. She could not decide which. The smallest one had discovered Kodiak at 3 weeks old and had made a unilateral decision about the nature and terms of their relationship, a decision that Kodiak had received with the dignity of a senior professional who has learned which battles to decline. These were not her animals. She had known this from the first night. She had known it in the culvert and in the truck and in the outbuilding at 4 in the morning, with her bare arms cold from the pipe, and she had known it every morning since. She had let herself forget it for the warmth it provided. The way you use a poor tool, because it is the one available, knowing you know better, knowing it does not matter. The release happened in March, on a morning when the snow had pulled back from the lower slopes, and the ground had become audible again, dripping and running and shifting under the snowmelt, with the sound of something long compressed, finding its natural shape. Nadia was there, Faber was there, and he had brought his thermos, and had also, in a development that required no comment and received none, brought a second thermos which he handed to Marin without looking at her, an act of consideration so unannounced it was almost defiant. They carried the carrier to the edge of the tree line, on the eastern slope, above the frozen culvert, above the guardrail, in the brown grass and the March light that came in, low and sideways, through the pines. The reserve's western boundary, redrawn by injunction and now under state management transition, pending the outcome of the prosecution, lay 2 miles from this tree line and was, as of that morning, free of any trap or device of any kind. Faber had personally confirmed this 2 days prior. He had not announced that he intended to confirm it. He had simply done it, and then mentioned it in passing, which was the way Faber communicated the things that mattered most to him. The kits came out of the carrier first, in the way of small animals encountering the world as a complete and unrestricted fact for the first time, with a combination of outrage at the scale of it and investigation of its particular textures that was nearly funny and entirely alive. They tumbled over each other and into the dead grass and back into each other with the furious, disorganized confidence of animals who have survived their first weeks and have concluded from this that survival is their natural condition. The vixen came out last. She stood in the March light on the repaired leg, and she placed it on the ground with a brief, assessing pause, 2 seconds in which she verified the leg against the ground and the ground against the leg, and then she accepted the verdict and moved forward. She looked at the tree line. She looked at the kits, who were already dispersing into the brown grass with the enthusiasm of the newly ambulatory. She looked at Marin. Marin looked back at her, the amber eyes steady and exhausted and present. The same quality she had seen in the culvert, in the dark, but different now, not exhausted toward absence but exhausted toward rest. The way a person looks after a long thing is finally finished, and the body is not yet caught up with the fact that it can stop now. Marin's hands were open at her sides. She did not close them. The vixen turned and moved into the tree line with a fluid, unhurried purpose, and the kits moved with her, gathering from their dispersal and falling into the rhythm of her movement, as if they had always known this rhythm and had simply been waiting for the moment it was available to them. In 40 seconds they were gone, the whole of them, the 5 of them, the 4 kits and the mother, into the light and the brown grass and the cold, running sound of the meltwater. Gone whole, gone well. The tree line settled back into its ordinary business. The pines moved in a light wind from the west. Kodiak stood beside Marin without leaning, without pressing, simply present. Simply there, in the way he was present for things that mattered. Marin stood with her open hands, and the paracord on her wrist, and the cold air on her face, and understood, in the delayed way of a thing that has been true for some time before it is known, that the room had opened, not because she had chosen to open it. She had tried for 3 years to keep it closed, and she had been good at it, and it had opened anyway, because something had arrived at the door, broken, and frightened, and alive, and had needed her to make room for it, and she had made room, and the room, it turned out, was larger than the grief she had been using to fill it. It always had been. The grief was still there. It was not smaller. It was simply not the only thing. The Hatcher County Wildlife Sanctuary and Rehabilitation Fund was incorporated as a Colorado nonprofit in April of the following year. Marin was its executive director. Nadia was its chief veterinary officer. Faber joined the founding board in his individual capacity rather than his official state capacity, an arrangement he and his district supervisor had worked out through a process he described to Marin as negotiated and to no one else as anything at all. Procedural objection attended all founding board meetings and was listed in the minutes as present, which was accurate, and as opinionated, which was an understatement. The property's outbuilding was expanded that spring, doubled in its usable floor space, with donated labor from 7 county residents who had shown up on a Saturday morning in mud boots and work gloves and had not needed to be asked twice about anything. The construction was completed in 3 weekends. The building was licensed as a Class B wildlife rehabilitation facility under state regulations by the end of May. The first operating season received 41 intake cases, 41 animals that had needed somewhere to go and had now had somewhere to go, and the number told you something about the need that had existed before the place existed to receive it, a need that had been invisible only because there had been nowhere to make it visible. Marin filed the number in the place she kept the numbers that mattered. She ordered the following season's supplies in November, in quantities that assumed a spring. Kodiak turned 11 in June. His precise birth date existed in a Navy working dog file that Marin kept in a metal box under the floor planks of the cabin's back room, alongside a letter from Daniel Reyes's family that she had not yet opened, and alongside Reyes's service photograph, which she had opened and which she kept face up in the file, his 26-year-old face looking directly at the camera with the specific expression of someone who is paying attention and intends to continue paying attention. The letter she had not yet opened. She knew this about herself. She accepted it as she accepted most things now, with the patience of someone who has learned that the timeline of grief is not hers to set. Kodiak's handler, a man named Torres, who was alive and well and living outside Eugene, Oregon, called every year on Kodiak's approximate birthday, a call he had never missed in 4 years, and this June he said, "How's he doing?" And Marin said, "He's doing," and Torres said, "And you?" And she said, "I'm doing too." Doing was a word she'd been using for 3 years. This June, it meant something different. Torres said, "Good, that's good," and Marin said, "You should come visit sometime." There was a pause. The pause of a man who has been waiting for a sentence he was not sure would arrive. Torres said, "I'll take you up on that." She said, "I'm counting on it." She pressed the paracord between her fingers, the frayed edge on the inside of her wrist, and she felt the familiar braiding under her fingertips, and she named the road she was standing on, which was her road, the dirt road leading up to her property, and she named the dog beside her, Kodiak, who was lying in the June sun with his working posture softened very slightly by the warmth and the 11 years and the accumulated weight of a life in which nothing had ever been asked of him that he had not given, and she named the feeling she was no longer suppressing, which was gratitude, a blunt and imprecise tool, the kind that leaves marks. The kind that means you were here, and something happened, and it mattered, and you are still here. She did not close her hands. There is a particular kind of light that arrives in the high country in the weeks after the cold breaks, A light that has nothing provisional or apologetic about it, that comes in low and gold and sideways through the pines and makes ordinary things look as if they are being looked at for the first time. As if the winter's long attention has stripped them down to their essential surfaces and left them clean and clear and precisely themselves. This light does not care whether you are ready for it. It does not wait for an invitation. It comes when it comes, on its own schedule, and what it finds when it arrives is what is actually there, not what you have arranged for it to see. This is what mercy is actually like. It does not arrive at a convenient time, on clean ground, with clean hands and an acceptable explanation of itself. It arrives in a ditch in a November storm with the shape of something broken and frightened and exhausted past fear, and it asks you to make room. And the room it needs turns out to be the one you have been sealing, the one you have been calling storage, calling safety, calling the understandable result of an understandable history. And you make the room because something in you, something older and less articulate than your reasons for not making it, remembers that you were built for exactly this, for the choosing, for the reaching in, for counting the living and holding the weight of the dead without setting it down. Because setting it down was never the instruction. The instruction was to carry it to the place where it transforms, where grief becomes the ground of something growing, where the sealed room becomes the open one, warm lit and larger than you remembered it, larger than the thing that was keeping it, where the rescue you performed alone in the dark turns out, when the light comes in sideways and gold through the trees, to have been the one that was always also being performed on you. The fox knew. Kodiak knew. You were the last to know, and that is all right. The last to know is still knowing. You stopped on a dark road when it was inconvenient. You went down into the cold. You counted the living, and you held the weight, and you chose the thing in front of you, and the thing in front of you was the door. The light is still coming through it. The door is still open. Make room.